The colonel's boots scraped against the frozen concrete as I pulled him through the doorway. His Iron Cross medal clinked against the floor. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from what I had just done, and what I was about to be ordered to do. General George S. Patton stood in the center of that room, his ivory-handled pistols gleaming under the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. He looked at the Nazi colonel. Then he looked at me. Private First Class James Walker, a 14-year-old kid from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who had never imagined he'd be standing in a frozen Belgian farmhouse in December 1944, holding a prisoner who might know where 10,000 American soldiers were about to walk into a trap. Patton's jaw was tight. His eyes were steel. "Walker," he said, in that voice that sounded like gravel being crushed under tank treads, "what happens in this room tonight could save the Third Army, or it could haunt you for the rest of your life. Either way, you don't leave until we get what we need." I swallowed hard. That night changed everything I thought I knew about war, about duty, about what it means to be a soldier, and about the thin, razor-sharp line between right and wrong when thousands of lives hang in the balance. This is my story, and I've never told it. Until now. I grew up hearing stories about the Great War from my grandfather, Thomas Walker, who had fought in the trenches of the Somme. He never talked about it much, just sat in his rocking chair on the porch, smoking his pipe, staring at something far away that none of us could see. When I was 8 years old, I asked him, "Grandpa, was it exciting, being a soldier?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "James, war is the most exciting thing a man can do, and the most terrible, and sometimes, God help you, it's both at the same time." I didn't understand what he meant then. By December 1944, I understood completely. I had enlisted in the United States Army in June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. I was 12 years old, fresh out of high school, full of fire and patriotism, and the kind of fearlessness that only exists before you've actually seen what a war does to a human body. My mother cried at the train station. My father shook my hand and said, "Make us proud, son." My kid sister, Margaret, handed me a small photograph of our family, all of us standing in front of our house on Maple Street, squinting into the summer sun. I kept that photograph in my breast pocket for the entire war. It took 2 years of training, shipping out, fighting in North Africa and then Sicily, before I found myself attached to General Patton's Third Army as it tore through France and drove toward Germany. By December 1944, I had seen enough combat to know that I was one of the lucky ones, still alive, still in one piece, still carrying that photograph. But nothing had prepared me for what was coming. December 16th, 1944. The Germans launched the largest offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. Hitler called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. We called it something else entirely. We called it Hell on Earth. 88 German divisions smashed through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, hitting American lines at their weakest point. The weather was brutal. Thick fog, blizzard conditions, temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The Luftwaffe couldn't fly, and neither could our planes, which meant no air support, no resupply drops, nothing but men and guns and frozen ground. I remember the first morning of the offensive. Our unit, Baker Company of the 317th Infantry Regiment, was positioned near a small Belgian town called Wiltz. We woke up at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of artillery that seemed to shake the entire earth. The ground trembled. The walls of the farmhouse we were billeted in cracked and shuddered. Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a barrel-chested Pole from Chicago who had been fighting since North Africa, burst through the door and screamed, "On your feet! Krauts are coming, and they ain't bringing Christmas presents." We scrambled. In the chaos and darkness and exploding shells, we ran to our positions. I remember thinking that the artillery fire was so heavy it looked like a second sunrise on the eastern horizon. Orange and red light, continuous, the sky itself on fire. What we didn't know yet, what nobody knew yet, was the full scope of what Hitler had unleashed. Over 200,000 German soldiers, 600 tanks. The objective, break through Allied lines, capture the crucial port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. If it worked, Germany might actually turn the tide of the war. It was the most desperate gamble in the history of the Third Reich, and for a few terrifying days, it looked like it might actually succeed. For 4 days, Baker Company fought a desperate fighting retreat through the Ardennes. We lost men every hour, good men. Johnson, the radio operator from Georgia who could play any song on his harmonica. Rodriguez, who carried a picture of his newborn daughter and said the rosary every morning. Hendricks, my foxhole buddy, who was planning to open a hardware store in Ohio after the war. Gone, all gone, in the space of 72 hours. By December 19th, we had pulled back to a position near the town of Martelange, south of Bastogne. It was here, while on a night patrol through the dense pine forest, that everything changed. There were 4 of us, me, Corporal Danny Briggs from Tennessee, Private Louis Fontaine, a French-Canadian who'd crossed the border specifically to enlist, and Sergeant Kowalski. We were pushing through knee-deep snow, moving silently in single file, when Kowalski held up his fist, the signal to stop. We froze. Through the trees, maybe 30 yards ahead, a light was flickering. A lantern, or a small fire. Voices, speaking in German, low and urgent. Kowalski gestured for us to spread out. We moved in a wide arc through the trees, the snow absorbing the sound of our boots. My heart was hammering so loud I was certain the Germans could hear it. We got close enough to see them. 3 men around a small fire, huddled over a map. One of them was wearing the uniform of an Oberst, a full colonel, in the Wehrmacht. The other 2 were aides. They were studying a map, and even from where I crouched behind a snow-covered pine, I could see that it was a detailed map of Allied positions. This was intelligence. This was operational planning. This colonel wasn't just any prisoner. He might know where the German advance was heading, which American units were being targeted, where the killing blow was going to fall. Kowalski looked at me. I nodded. We moved. It happened fast. Kowalski and Briggs took the 2 aides before they could make a sound. Fontaine and I went for the colonel. He was older, maybe 55, silver-haired with the Iron Cross at his throat. He reached for his pistol, but I got there first, grabbing his wrist and twisting until he dropped it. Then I had my forearm across his throat, and I was dragging him backward, away from the fire, into the dark trees. He struggled. He was stronger than he looked. He said something in German. I didn't speak German, but the contempt in his voice needed no translation. I didn't stop. I kept dragging. His boots scraped furrows through the snow. We got him back to the farmhouse. The cold room was what we called the stone-walled back section of the farmhouse, an old dairy room, maybe 20 feet by 15, with a stone floor and no heat, and one small window that looked out on nothing but snow and darkness. We had been using it to store ammunition. Now we dragged the colonel inside and sat him against the far wall. He looked at us with absolute cold contempt. Even as a prisoner, zip-tied and disarmed and surrounded by 4 American soldiers, he projected the arrogance of a man who believed completely in his own superiority. He said nothing, just stared, and then the door opened. General George S. Patton walked in. I had seen Patton at a distance before, from 50 yards, 100 yards. Everyone in the Third Army knew who he was. You couldn't miss him. The gleaming helmet, the riding crop, the ivory-handled pistols, the absolute physical authority of a man who had been born for war. But I had never been in the same room with him. He was taller than I expected. And his eyes were something I've never forgotten, cold, blue, intense, completely focused. The eyes of a man who calculated everything in terms of soldiers' lives and military objectives, and who had long ago made his peace with what war required. He looked at the Nazi colonel. He looked at the map we had taken. Then he looked at me. "You're Walker?" "Yes, sir. Private First Class James Walker, sir." "You brought him in?" "Yes, sir." He studied me for a moment. Then he looked back at the colonel. "Walker," he said quietly, "what happens in this room tonight could save the Third Army, or it could haunt you for the rest of your life. Either way, you don't leave until we get what we need." The silence in that cold room was absolute. Here is what I knew in December 1944, that the history books sometimes gloss over. Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, were encircled by German forces, outnumbered, outsupplied, fighting in blizzard conditions with no winter gear, low ammunition, and no air support because of the fog. The German commander had sent a demand for their surrender. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had responded with a single word: nuts. It was magnificent, it was defiant, and it didn't change the fact that 18,000 Americans were surrounded and the Germans were tightening the ring. Patton had already done the impossible. He had turned his entire Third Army 90 degrees north in less than 48 hours, a logistical miracle that military historians still study. His columns were driving hard toward Bastogne to break the encirclement. But German resistance was fierce, and every hour cost lives. The colonel we had captured was, we now knew from the map, the operations officer for one of the panzer divisions blocking Patton's relief column. If he knew the exact defensive positions, the locations of the tank traps, the minefields, the artillery, it could save hundreds, maybe thousands of American lives. Patton looked at me and said, "The brutal field order. Walker, you will serve as my interpreter's assistant and witness tonight. Major Hendricks will conduct the interrogation. Your job is to watch and to remember everything you see and hear. You are not to leave this room. You are not to speak unless spoken to. And whatever happens in here, you understand that this information, if we get it, goes directly to the relief column. It goes to the boys in Bastogne. It could mean the difference between those men living or dying before Christmas." He paused. "Can you handle that, son?" I was 22 years old. I was exhausted and cold, and I had buried 3 of my friends in the last 4 days. I thought about Hendricks, who had talked about his hardware store. I thought about the 18,000 men surrounded in Bastogne. "Yes, sir," I said. "I can handle it." What happened in that cold room over the next 4 hours, I will not describe in full detail. Not because it was torture in the Hollywood sense. It wasn't. Major Hendricks was a trained intelligence officer who understood that reliable information comes from psychology, not brutality. What happened was something more subtle and more devastating. A long, careful, relentless dismantling of a man's certainty that he would give nothing away. The colonel, whose name, we learned, was Oberst Friedrich Brandt, was a career Wehrmacht officer who had served since 1936. He was not SS. He was not a fanatic in the Nazi ideological sense. He was a soldier, a professional, and he believed in his duty to Germany with the same sincerity that I believed in my duty to America. That, in some ways, made it harder, because somewhere in that long, cold night, I stopped seeing him as an enemy and started seeing him as a man with his own family somewhere in Germany, a man who had his own photograph in his breast pocket. I could see the slight rectangular outline under his uniform. A man who was afraid, despite his contempt, despite his arrogance, despite everything. He held out for 3 hours. At hour 3, Major Hendricks pulled out a simple piece of paper and said quietly, "Oberst Brandt, the war is over for Germany. You know this. Your Ardennes offensive has already failed strategically. You have not captured the fuel depots at Spa or Stavelot, which were the only things that could have kept your panzer columns moving. You are running out of fuel. You are running out of time. And the men you are trying to protect, your soldiers in those defensive positions, they are going to die when our artillery zeroes in on them using estimated coordinates. Estimated. But if you give us the exact positions, we can target only military assets. We can avoid the farm where your medics are treating your wounded. It was the medics that broke him." Brandt closed his eyes. When he opened them, there were tears in them, the first crack in that iron composure. He started talking. The information Brandt provided was transmitted to the Third Army's relief columns within the hour. I don't know exactly what they did with it. That was above my pay grade, above my clearance, above everything. But I know what happened next. On December 26, 1944, 2 days after that night in the cold room, Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement and reached Bastogne. The road into Bastogne was lined with American soldiers who had been fighting for 9 days in conditions of almost unimaginable hardship. When the relief column came through, the men who had been surrounded, frozen, hungry, exhausted, some of them with frostbitten feet so bad they would never walk normally again, those men cheered. Some of them wept, some of them just stood there in the snow and looked at the approaching tanks with expressions I don't have words to describe. I was with the advance elements that entered Bastogne that day. I saw a young soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, standing at the side of the road. He was wrapped in a horse blanket because he didn't have a proper winter coat. His face was gaunt and grey with cold and exhaustion. And when our convoy came through, he raised his fist, not in a V for victory salute, just a raised fist. And he said quietly, almost to himself, "Took you long enough." I laughed. I think I cried a little too. Don't tell anyone. 3 days after Bastogne was relieved, I was summoned to a briefing. I thought it was routine. It wasn't. Patton was there. He looked at me across the table and said something I have carried with me for 80 years. "Walker, what you did in that farmhouse, bringing in that prisoner, standing your post through the night, that's not the kind of thing that makes the newspapers. Nobody's going to write a story about it. You're not going to get a medal for it. But I want you to know something." He paused. "The men who came down that road into Bastogne, some of them are alive today because of what happened in that cold room. And that's worth more than any medal I could pin on you." He extended his hand. I shook it. General George S. Patton's hand. Rough, strong, the hand of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for and fighting wars. "Merry Christmas, Walker," he said. "Merry Christmas, sir," I said. It was December 29th, 1944. We were standing in the ruins of a Belgian town in the middle of winter, surrounded by the wreckage of the most savage battle on the Western Front. It was, somehow, the best Christmas I ever had. I kept that photograph, the one my sister Margaret gave me at the train station, through all of it. North Africa, Sicily, France, the Ardennes. I kept it through the crossing of the Rhine, through the liberation of concentration camps that made the Ardennes look almost civilized by comparison, through VE Day on May 8, 1945, when the war in Europe was finally officially over. I took the photograph out on VE Day and looked at it for a long time. My family on Maple Street, squinting into the summer sun. Before everything, I thought about Hendricks and Johnson and Rodriguez. I thought about Oberst Brandt, who had cried for his medics. I thought about the young soldier wrapped in a horse blanket who said, "Took you long enough." I thought about what my grandfather had said when I was 8 years old. War is the most exciting thing a man can do, and the most terrible, and sometimes, God help you, it's both at the same time. Grandpa, I thought, you had no idea how right you were. I am 96 years old as I tell this story. My hands shake when I write. My eyesight isn't what it was. Most of the men I served with are gone. Kowalski, Briggs, Fontaine, Major Hendricks, all of them gone. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold war memories.